Well, this week we're going to talk about Chapter 11, Firefighting Realities. And we're within a couple of weeks of the end of this course, or a couple of modules to the end of this course. And I'm sure that you've noticed in your book, there are 15, actually 16 chapters, maybe, I forget. And yet we're only at Chapter 11 with just a couple of weeks to go. Well, we're going to cover map reading next week. And this week, we're going to talk about the station fire. Next week, we're going to talk about the 30-mile fire. But on the subjects of hazmat, I've mentioned before, I'll mention it again here, safety, isolation, notification. That's what you need to remember, okay? You can read the chapter. It's a good chapter. It's worth reading. But that's the main part of dealing with hazmat on wildland fires. The fire prevention portion, if you have taken my fire prevention course, we talk about that in much more detail. And we try and squeeze it in every semester, but sometimes we just don't get to that part. It is good to pre-plan your different areas and make sure that everybody has their adequate clearance. I feel wholeheartedly the Paradise disaster would not have been so bad if more of those homes had adequate fire clearance. It still would have been a bad fire, but there wouldn't have been as high of losses of buildings and people if the clearances were better. It had not been cleared in a very long time. And then there's a great chapter that I think everybody should read on the use and care of your wildland tools. Really, you should read that one and look it over. Great chapter on how to take care of your equipment. Okay, well, let's get going with firefighting realities. So, we've all made mistakes. Who hasn't made a mistake? We're all human, and everybody makes mistakes. Now, some mistakes are embarrassing, and some mistakes could be devastating or lead to fatalities. I worked with a paramedic that once got his decimal point in the wrong place when he was loading up Valium to give a patient. So instead of, giving him 0.1, he gave him 1 and overdosed his patient, realized his mistake afterwards, but back in those days, and sometimes in some districts you still have to do this, you had to call the hospital before you could give another drug or each drug. So he calls back to the hospital and requests Narcan, and they're saying, "Why do you need Narcan?" And he had to admit, I overdosed my patient. I put him into respiratory arrest. So fortunately, when he used the Narcan, the patient started breathing again. But that's the kind of mistake you don't want to make. I always like to tell the story of my most embarrassing moment. But again, nobody died. I almost ended up having the most embarrassing moment of all time. But I went in the wrong bathroom at an Islands restaurant. And now we've all kind of done that. But I did this big time. When we got to this restaurant, we'd never been to this one before. It was the first time we'd ever been there. And you park in a parking lot behind it, an underground parking lot. So you can come in through the front door on one side or the back door from the parking lot side. So we came in through the back door. And as we walked in, I noticed the bathrooms to the right. And the one bathroom that was facing me had a picture of a woman in a bathing suit next to it. And I kind of noticed that because she was in a bathing suit. We went to the front, got our seats. After we got seated, I said, "Hey, I gotta go wash my hands in the bathroom." So I walk in, and I've mentally seen that picture of a woman next to the one side. So in my mind, I just assumed that was the women's bathroom, and the other one was the men's. And so I went in the one that had a picture actually of a man next to it, who was checking out the waves and holding his surfboard, checking out the waves. So I went in that one thinking it was the men's restroom. Washed my hands. Nobody was in there. Didn't even notice that it wasn't set up like a men's restroom. Walked out. We ate our meal. Everything was fine. Well, then at the end of the meal, I said to my wife, I got to go to the bathroom before we go. And she's like, you just went to the bathroom before we ate. I said, no, all I did was wash my hands. I got to really go to the bathroom. So I go into the bathroom, and again, nobody's in there. And again, I looked at the one picture next to the one side that had a girl on it because, well, she was in her bathing suit and she was looking kind of good. And I'm staring at that one. Never once looked at the actual words on the door, right? And I went inside, went into one of the stalls, and I'm sitting there and somebody else comes in the bathroom. And this person kind of makes a sound, like clears their throat. And I thought, that's kind of weird. And then they sit in the stall next to me, and they got purple tennis shoes. And I thought, what kind of sissy wears purple tennis shoes, And I'm thinking, well, that's odd. And then I thought about the sound that the person made that kind of sounded like a female. And that's when all of a sudden it dawned on me when I looked next to me, and I hadn't even noticed it. There's a trash can. Just a clue for you females listening to this. In a men's restroom, there isn't a trash can next to the toilets. Only in unisex bathrooms and in women's bathrooms. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in the wrong bathroom. And I could just see it, now. LA County firefighter caught in women's restroom, I was so embarrassed. I waited until the other person left and got out of there as fast as I could, told my wife and my kids what I had done. We all had a big laugh about it. It was a horrible mistake, but it was only an embarrassing mistake. But the mistakes that you make on a wildland fire could be devastating. People could die. So we need to think about those kind of mistakes and make sure that we remember. Why have we talked about all these fatality fires during this semester? Well, we talk about the fires in the past because Edmund Burke once said, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And it's a famous saying, and it's famous because it's true. You need to know about mistakes that others have made and do your best to remember that when you're in similar situations. So, as we talk about firefighting realities, we need to come to grips with the fact that we need to keep things in perspective and realize this is a dangerous profession. Our choices are choices that can make the difference between life and death, between injury and safety. So the wildland fire environment is the most dynamic environment of all the challenges that firefighters face because it is constantly changing, and the longer the fire is in place, as it can go for weeks, months. Yellowstone burned almost all summer. So, fires can constantly change. And so we need to be aware it's a dynamic situation because of topography, fuel, and weather are constantly changing. So we have to make a plan, and make a plan that's a course of action that minimizes risks and gets the best benefit. So we call that, cost versus gain, risk versus benefit. If the plan creates a higher risk to firefighters and public safety to protect property that will regrow or can be replaced, we need to rethink it if firefighters are at too great of a risk. We call that cost versus gain or risk versus benefit. Lastly, the benefits must outweigh the risks. So here's an image of a firefighter standing against a building. What's that building going to do? It's going to trap all the heat that's coming. And all he's got is a 1-inch hose line. Now that 1-inch hose line, let's say it's 1.5 inches. Even if it's 1.5 inches, the most he's going to get out of this is 60 gallons per minute. He's probably got a nozzle that's less than 40 gallons a minute. And do you think, I'm looking at those flame lengths, and they are minimum 30 foot. They haven't hit that tree yet, and that tree is 30 foot. So it's 30 to 40 foot flame lengths, and he's standing thinking he's going to save this house. So I know the story behind this image. The person took the picture and then came up and said, "Hey, what are you doing? You should not be here. Let's go to the other side. We'll come out and try and save this thing after the fire burns over." So you got to think about what you're doing. Don't get so focused on your assignment that you're not thinking about the safety factor and your risks. So there's a famous guy named Dr. Gordon Graham, and he says if it's predictable, it's preventable. If you use your fire behavior indicators and realize that you're at great risk, why not change your plan? It's just so simple. And yet we because of machismo, or because, well, the chief told me to do it, we just go ahead. We push forward. If it's predictable, it's preventable. He also said we haven't found any new ways to kill firefighters in the last 50 years. So why do we keep doing things that get people killed? We need to understand why. Because you can't change what you don't know. So we need to learn from the past. We need to think about what we're doing. And we also need to realize we don't always know all of the factors around us. So we need to think about worst case scenario. Okay? You don't want to be a nervous Nelly. I'm not telling you not to do your job because you're so scared. That's not it. But think about what you're doing and pay attention to what's going on around you. So I include this slide just because, and this will be on a copy that doesn't have the video that you can go through in our module. But Dr. Gordon Graham has some great websites, and he's involved in the Firefighters Close Calls. These are websites you can look at, especially when you are in your firefighter safety and survival class. So risk management is where we think about that risk versus benefit, or cost versus gain. And they put these into 4 categories: high frequency, high risk. Now, these are very dangerous, but because we do it all the time, we're used to it, we're well trained, and we're pretty ready. And if it's high frequency, high risk, all of our danger radar is on. But then, the 2 categories that aren't as concerning: low frequency, low risk; high frequency, low risk. Our EMT calls. These are usually high frequency, low risk. Now, these days, there's some pretty crazy people out there. So sometimes these are high frequency but high risk, and but most of the time, low frequency or high frequency, low risk. But what's the one that concerns us the most? Low frequency, high risk. When we don't do it very often, then we're not always aware of all of the dangers involved, and maybe we haven't been as well trained. So we don't have that experience. So remember, in our low frequency, high risk situations, when you're building a fire line downhill, we need to step back and make sure that we pull out our IRPG and consider all of the factors. Sometimes we just don't see something coming, and we don't know what we don't know. So, or we don't have time to react to what's going on. So, our book has this Fire Chief Jake who's always pointing things out to us. Here in this image, Fire Chief Jake is pointing to this wildland fire where firefighters are protecting this house, and they're looking at the fire coming up on them, not realizing that the fire's already spotted behind them and that it's building behind them, which is going to cause the intensity of the fire in front of them to be way greater. In fact, because the smoke is so thick, you can barely see it. It's spotting on all sides of this house, behind it, on the uphill, on both sides. So, they're in for this fire's going to pick up in great intensity. So sometimes, as Jake says, you may not know what you don't know. So make sure you have a lookout. Make sure you're doing walkarounds, and don't be on the side that the fire is rushing up on a house. So we call this situational awareness, being aware. We mentioned the term size up a lot in the last couple of weeks, and it's something we do when we first arrive. But of course, size up should constantly be repeated. And so we call that situational awareness, taking a second look to look up, pay attention to what's going on around you. So if you do that, you could be the one who saves your whole crew. Situational awareness is being aware of what is happening all around you, not being so focused on your job that you're not continually sizing up or doing what we call look up, look down, look all around. My old Chief Harris used to say, put your head on a swivel, like those old lights on the fire engines, like the 1960s ones that had a big like bulb on top with a spinning red light that spun around. He says, make your head like that spinning light, spinning round and round, constantly looking what's above me, what's below me, what's around me. And be the one who says something when you see something. So in broad terms, situational awareness is learned knowledge, training from our book, from the IRPG, from classes and certifications that we get, experience gained on the fire ground, understanding the rules of engagement and knowing your assignment, gathering new information. Remember, base all actions on current and expected fire behavior. And, pay attention. So I love this picture of this guy who's walking with his drip torch. It's just a beautiful picture. But it reminds us that, when we're out on the fire line, we're doing things like this. Fire could be picking up in great intensity. So we need to pay attention to what's most important overall. Well, there's a reason why it's standard firefighting order number 1. It's the weather, stupid. Okay? Keep informed on all fire weather conditions and forecasts. Remember that sometimes what we're feeling and seeing around us is not what's going on in the big picture. We're going to talk about this week when we have our Zoom meeting, the station fire where a plume domination was going on the day that 2 firefighters died, and they didn't realize it. And it changed the behavior of the fire in a way that they couldn't have predicted when they didn't know that it was a plume-dominated fire. So you may not know what you don't know. So anticipate the unexpected and be that person that thinks about worst-case scenario. Before I was in fire prevention, I didn't think this way as much as I should. And now I think about things all the time. Okay, what do we do if this happens? What do we do if that happens? So, we need to think about it. Think about making a plan. Never assume it can't happen to you, because you could be dead wrong. So use all your tools. We talked about the IRPG, the 10s and 18s, the LCES, our checklists, organizers, all of these kind of things. Use those tools. And one of the big tools that we use is, let's put a lookout out there. But if we put out a lookout, what do we have to have? Give that lookout a trigger point. And a trigger point's an event, a response, an action. So it occurs when a predetermined event or a series of events reaches the point where it activates a planned response, our alternate or contingency or emergency plan. So we have our primary plan. That's what we're working on. We're going to build a fire line in a certain place, and we're going to start burning out. Okay, that's our primary plan. What's our alternate plan? Well, if things turn, we're going to start moving back towards our escape route. A contingency plan. We might even think about, if we had to, where would we deploy? A really good trainer or supervisor, superintendent, crew boss, whatever, when they're training, will periodically just yell, deploy, deploy, deploy. And push people to think about, well, what if we got burned over right now? What if something changed that we weren't expecting? So the key to success in using trigger points is to have a realistic parameter and to do what you plan to do when the trigger point has been reached. Because a lot of times we're so into our job, we don't want to give it up. I do this all the time. I'm focused on something, and my wife calls me to dinner. And I'm like, no, I can't do that now. I need to finish this job. Well, in reality, a lot of times, yeah, I can. It's just I'm focused on my job. So if you are out there working and the trigger point gets reached, your lookout says move, don't think about it. When your crew boss yells, drop everything and run, don't carry your tools, which will slow you down. In the South Canyon fire, one of the females that died was holding her chainsaw in her arms and had her pack and everything with her. And, maybe, and she was close to the top of the ridge, maybe if she'd dropped her pack and dropped her chainsaw, she would have just got there a little bit faster and maybe got over the ridge. It's hard to say. But when your crew boss says, drop everything and run, drop everything and run. So another one of those realities we need to remember is that when we're out there arriving at fires, there's different rules of engagement. So we have to ask ourselves, who's responsible here? Whose rules are we following? I just threw on here the two symbols of the national parks and the U.S. Forest Service. Very, very different rules. Very different rules. But I didn't throw on here, I'll talk about them. Why does it matter? Why does it matter whose rules? Well, who's responsible is an important question to ask, because we need to ask ourselves who's paying the bill, and it may influence who's the IC. It definitely determines those rules you play by. So different agencies have different missions and different responsibilities. Hey, I've worked with the Santa Monica Conservancy, and they're so particular. If you step on the wrong flower, you're going to get fined. Not just picking it. Oh, I accidentally stepped on it. You're going to get a ticket, okay? So they're very particular about the way you visit their property, as well as, the rules in fighting a fire. So when you work for someone, you got to obey their rules, not your rules. I think I mentioned to you that, there's so many different jurisdictions. Where I worked, just outside my jurisdiction, the last station I worked at was an incorporated city of Santa Clarita. Most of the area around us was LA County. And just outside, within those boundaries of LA County, part of it was state responsibility area, where the state was going to pay the bill. And then just beyond that was the National Forest, Angeles National Forest. But there's also National Monument, National Park, National Wilderness Area. Gosh, in a wilderness area, you can't drive a vehicle. The only thing is feet and hooves. You can be dropped in by copter or smoke jumpers, walk in, or pack in with mules. It's feet and hoofs, only natural things in a wilderness area. This was a big problem in the Rough Fire, and we've talked about that before. So all these different places have different rules of engagement, and you may be told to back off. Let it burn. So a lot of jurisdictions or a lot of fire departments have a let it burn policy, and this is becoming kind of something that's more of the future. We're going to see this because a lot of scientists believe we should not be fighting fire so aggressively, and it's a proven fact that fire is good for the environment. Not necessarily these really big ones, but fire is good for the environment. So if, though, you make the decision to let it burn, it should at least be monitored. One of the problems with the Yellowstone fire was that they just let it get too big. So remember that if in May you make a decision that you're going to let a fire burn, you need to realize that this summer and in the fall, you're going to have more intense repercussions. So you got to think about the economical, the political, the social consequences that a let it burn policy presents, and Yellowstone is the perfect example. And here's just 4 photos. Any of you who have been to Yellowstone, I've not been there, but I've talked to a lot of people who have been there in the last couple of years, and many of these areas are still scarred. One of the most beautiful places in the whole world was devastated by a fire that they let get out of control that burned for months and months and months. So if you're going to let it burn, don't let it get so huge that it's unstoppable. The only thing that stopped Yellowstone, in fact, there were some portions that were still burning after the winter snows. So, yeah, you got to consider that. Also, we need to be aware of our incident objectives. So, whether it's a let it burn or the assignments that we're given, if no one knows what they're supposed to do, you can't get the job done. So, people need to know what is wanted from them, not just the objective or not just the assignment, but the objective, the purpose behind the assignment. So, without objectives, we can't get the job done. Now, as we move on, one of the things we need to consider is group decisions or crew cohesiveness. Do we have that kind of leader that won't listen to anybody? You might want to transfer to a different crew. You want to work for somebody who's very experienced, very well trained, knows what they're doing, but also is willing to work with and listen to their crew. So it's usually best when many heads are used to develop appropriate strategies. Now, we are a paramilitary organization. It's not a democracy. But a good leader listens to his crew or her crew. So there are exceptions to following orders. And so, we need to say what we think and not just go with the group think. Sometimes we'll hear somebody say something, and even though in our head we think it's wrong, we don't say anything. Or maybe if we talk it over a little bit, we might realize, oh, they were right. I just didn't have all the facts. So what's interesting is it's constant. It's not just every once in a while. Consistently, the survivors of fatality fires will mention that they knew they were doing something that was wrong. They were violating a watch out or a standard firefighting order. We knew we were, but we thought we could do it. Because let's be honest, a lot of times we do when we're fighting these fires. All the time. So the author of our book points out a book that he read about management called the Abilene Paradox, where a group of people end up going on a trip to Abilene to go watch a movie, and actually none of them wanted to go. And the car stalls and has a mechanical problem on the way to Abilene, and they end up all yelling at each other in this big argument about, well, I didn't even want to go. But everybody was trying to please the other person, so somebody had brought it up as a possibility, trying to make other people happy, and actually nobody was happy with the decision. So the point of the book was, listen to your inner voice of caution and speak up if you don't agree, and don't always just be so compliant that you go along in a situation where something inside you saying it's not the right to do. So remember, rank does not mean you are the best person on the fire. Learn who you can trust and listen to the veterans. I don't, we're almost done here, but I don't want to take a whole bunch of time with stories, but I have to tell this one. There was a fire that was in an area that where the Glendale firefighter was burned that we have talked about, and LA City rigs got burned. And a firefighter captain, a guy that I knew who actually worked under me, who I didn't trust him then. I didn't have any confidence in him then. And later on, he was smart, but he wasn't street smart. He became a captain. And one of my other friends said he'd been given an assignment, and he was in the exact same place where these LA City fire engines had burned. So my friend came up and said, hey, you don't want to be here. And he says, well, this is where I was assigned to be. He says, yeah, still, you need to tell the chief the situation, and you need to move over near where we are, and then we'll respond after the fire burns over. No, I can't do that. The chief told me to be here. And they had this big argument. Finally, this friend of mine said, who is a very big man, and the guy who was the other captain that I don't have any confidence in was not a very big man. And he said to him, he grabbed him by the shirt. He literally grabbed him by the shirt, and he had his fist, and he said, you move your crew right now, or I'm going to knock you out. Okay, that's a little extreme, but he was serious. And finally, the guy, shaken, says, okay, let's move. They moved, and it wasn't a full hour. It was within the next hour. That area burned over, and if they had been there, they would have all died. Fire engine would have been just a bunch of rusty metal. It was exactly what they predicted. So there are situations when the best person for the assignment isn't necessarily the person in command there. It's the people with the best experience. So do not confuse titles or years of service with experience. Sometimes we have too much reliance on fire managers, or playing too much reliance on the air tankers, the helicopters, the strike teams, and all of the stuff that we're using. We need to just make sure that we're each taking care of our own crews. Look up, look down, look all around. Hey, the Yarnell Hill guys, the Granite Mountain Hotshots, they were calling for an airdrop, and that airdrop might have helped, but they couldn't get it. They couldn't get it in time, and the air tanker couldn't figure out where they were. And so, don't count on an air tanker or a helicopter to come and save the day. Do your part. Use your training, your experience, make you the most valuable tool on the fire line. So constantly monitor the weather. Pay attention to the aspect and the terrain you're on, and where your other crew members are. And remember, you do have the right to refuse. A turn down is a situation where you as an individual turn it down. When it comes to safety, you are in charge. So you have the right to refuse, but you better be able to give a good reason why you did, because we are paramilitary. But if it is a violation of safe work practices, if the environmental conditions make the work unsafe, if you lack the necessary qualifications, somebody says, I want you to burn that out, and you say, well, wait, I'm not qualified for burning. Say so. Defective equipment is being used. If you've got an old reserve engine and you've been asked to drive into some really risky territory and you're not four-wheel drive, tell them, hey, I don't have the right kind of engine for that, So let's move on. We're going to talk about small fires versus big fires, but we kind of already talked about this. Remember, small fires are usually two-dimensional. They're going to last that day. Rarely do they go overnight to the next day. There's usually one factor. It's burning up a hillside, or they're not necessarily wind-driven fires. They're more weather and topography-driven fires. So the spread of a small fire can usually be predicted where it's going to go. So now when we go from a small incident to a bigger incident with extended attack. We got to be really aware in those times. That is when confusion can become the dominant factor, and especially when structures are being threatened. So the vast majority of wildland fires are controlled in a day or maybe 2 at the most. But it's that 5%, those Thomas fires, Paradise or Campfire, Yarnell Hill. Actually, Yarnell Hill was not huge, but it killed firefighters. But these bigger fires that get out of control and become large, they're more like 5%. So in our large fires, we need to move into that third dimension. And remember, we're going to be defensive. We're going to be not direct attack. We're going to be doing a lot of indirect attack and also defensive, protecting as many structures. And these fires are usually plume or wind driven, and we're going to do what we can, but a lot of times it's until the weather changes or until what's dominating the fire changes. It's very hard for us to stop this thing. So when fire moves into that category of large or big event, we're going to use a different methodology, and we've talked about this a lot. We're going to anchor it, and we're going to start a flanking attack, but really all our actions are going to be indirect and defensive. So the general rule with a large fire, be productive, but wait until the weather is going to change. And I can't tell you how many fires a rain or a snowfall ended the fire. Not necessarily us. So in the mega fires, the really, really, really big ones, we just got to stay out of the way and use our heads. Blow-ups, like we've talked about, like South Canyon, can kill a lot of people. This wasn't a significantly huge fire, but the blow-up was rapid, extreme, and cost 14 firefighters their lives. So the tunnel fire is an example of a fire that started one day, and we've talked about this a lot, started one day, was not adequately mopped up. Next day, it blew out of control, wind-driven, not a huge amount of acres, but when you talk about 25 people dying, including a battalion chief and a police officer and 23 civilians, and 3,800 homes. And this is in the San Francisco area, where Oakland area, where these were, in today's terms, you try and find a house under $1 million in that area today. These are very expensive homes. So huge dollar loss. The Cedar Fire was now one of our truly mega fires, 280,293 acres, 15 firefighters died, 4,800 buildings, and it was a fire that just whipped out of control. So mega fire operations, what are we going to do? We're going to get an incident action plan, but actually it's going to be always a day late, $1 short. Events are changing so fast, the information is obsolete. So we need to be practicing safe practices, doing what we can. Mega fires violate all the rules, so we need to look out, prepare for the unexpected, and think worst case scenario. Thinking big means looking ahead, not allowing the fire to be in charge. So be a worst case scenario thinker. Think about, okay, what if the wind changes? What if da-da-da-da-da? So just have that in the back of your head. Again, I'm not telling you to be a nervous Nelly. I'm telling you to think ahead. Think ahead. Think about what really is going to happen. Think about the possibilities and their consequences. What is our alternatives? Are there different ways? Do we need to build this line downhill, or should we let this burn out and try and keep it from jumping the road? These are things that we got to think about. Also remember that not all crews and not all engines are equal. So, when you're a Type 1 crew, don't go trying to go way off-road. When you have a city crew or a crew that does not fight wildland fire a lot, Don't put them in the most extreme parts. Experience, leadership, all of these things matter. Motivation. A lot of LA City rigs are not even set up to really do wildland firefighting. So let's let them do the structure protection. Don't have them out there doing progressive hose lays or whatever. Remember, in the wildland urban interface, we have some different kinds of watch out situations. Any wood construction would shake roof. Remember those bridge load limits we talked about. Remember, we're going to have a lot of poor access and narrow and sometimes dirt roads, one-way roads. Remember, there's people out there that are panicked and they're driving like maniacs in the smoke, not even knowing what's on the other side. So you don't want to be walking around the roads thinking that nobody's coming. Remember that we've got inadequate water and structures that are located in chimneys, narrow or box canyons with steep slopes 30% or greater probably can't protect those. Don't be afraid to write a building off and go save another one that you know you can save. So all of this is all about situational avoidance, right? Be aware of the situations to avoid. If you have no anchor point, if you're on a mobile attack in rough terrain, you're doing hose lays with small diameter hose. Now, at least 1.5 inches for your hose lays. Poorly located fire line. You don't want to be above the fire when it's in alignment, right? We've talked about that a million times. When you're working around heavy equipment, be aware of the heavy equipment and don't get run over. Know what kind of a hand crew you're on or that's working with you. When you have a juvenile prison hand crew, you want to treat them different than a professional hand crew, a U.S. Forest hotshot crew. So just keep to the basics. This is what I'm hoping you go away from this class with. And so you don't have to be fancy, don't have to be, doing all the greatest things. Just do the basics. Anchor your line, flank the fire, hold the line that you put in, work at night when you can, but be aware there's a lot of dangers there, and take care of yourself. Always have a safe place to move to. Remember your LCES and your look up, look down, look all around. Okay, if you speak up, see something, say something. Don't ever underestimate how quickly a situation can change. Base all actions on current and expected fire behavior. It's just dirt and trees. It'll grow back. So be aware. Don't fear the fire, but always respect what it has the potential to do. So, last slide. So what now, right? We're going to reflect on the station fire when we have a Zoom in this module. And we're going to learn what happened when 2 experienced firefighters with a plan lost their lives and how that happened. And then next week, we're going to talk about map reading. We're going to analyze the 30-mile fire where lives were lost because of complacency and incompetence. Only fire I know of where an IC was criminally prosecuted. Lastly, you're going to analyze an assigned fire for your final project and share what you learned from it. So think about this lecture and the firefighter realities and the things that we've talked about when you do your final project. Sorry, this was a little longer than I planned, but I told too many stories. Miss you guys. See you on Thursday. Do not forget we have a con for Zoom. And if you're listening to this on another semester because I recorded it, sorry, you might have a different assignment than what I just said. Okay.